guide and direct us as we tear apart the Word of God and pull it apart and unpack it and help us to have understanding and to know what the Word of God is saying in the application. And we want to give thanks to you and praise to you for what you do in Jesus' name. Amen. So this brings us up to, and it'd be like number 13 on your sheet, the responsibility for one's life. Verse 16, I'll read it to you, and then we'll talk about it. The fathers shall not be put to death for the children, neither shall the children be put to death for the fathers, but every man shall be put to death for his own sin. And so again, this shows the idea of personal responsibility. It's very similar to in Ezekiel, and I think I might have wrote that down on your notes there, but Ezekiel 18 in verse 20, very similar to this. Let me read to you the Ezekiel passage. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. Right? That's just everybody dies because everybody sinned. Right? It's kind of a general statement. The son, however, shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. Everybody's responsible for their own sin and wrongdoing. And so I'm not responsible for my father's sin, and my father wasn't responsible for what I did. I have to bear that responsibility alone. Now, there's a couple other thoughts here. One is sometimes there's repercussions of sin. And so the example would be David and Bathsheba. They sinned and their son died, right? The baby died. And that was a judgment of God. Baby didn't do anything wrong, right? Didn't have a choice. It was David and Bathsheba, right? But the baby died as a judgment against them. So sometimes things like that will happen. 2 Samuel 21, 7 grandsons of Saul were executed by the Gibeonites, and David turned them over. There was some wrongdoing from what Saul did to some of these Gibeonites, and they wanted retribution for that. And so the son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, he was spared, but they turned over these other grandsons, 7 of them, and they were executed. Repercussions, sometimes that happens in situationship, Bill. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right. Mm-hmm. Oh, my word, yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. It is, right? It's the devil and its insanity that goes on in this world, right? Jim.
By the same token, I have heard that how often someone said this
Mm-hmm.
and mother.
I know, right? Yeah. I'm sure Hitler was a cute little boy when he was a little boy, right? But people grow up and they make choices, right? Sometimes pretty bad. So we do see that, and sometimes, the guilty people, we make them victims, and we see a lot of that insanity that goes on. So Exodus chapter 21, I wanted to turn over because this, I think he gets this. Again, Moses is just pulling from Exodus, and he reiterates some of the laws. He doesn't go through every single one, but I got here Exodus chapter 21, 28 and 29. It says, if an ox gore a man or a woman, and that they die, then the ox shall surely be stoned, right? Kill the animal, and his flesh shall not be eaten. The owner of the ox shall not be quit. This is what it says in the Old King James, and that word quit there has the idea of he shall not be held liable or guilty. Verse 29, but if the ox were wont, it says in the Old King James, to push, it was wont, in other words, he has the reputation, that animal has hurt people before, right, to push, and with his horn in time past, and it has been testified to the owner, right? They said, hey, your animal's doing some damage here, and he didn't keep him in. He let that animal out. But he killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and the owner shall be put to death. He should have got rid of that animal, killed it, or made sure that thing didn't get out, and that thing got out. We see this with dogs, right? You know, dogs that are known to be vicious, and then they get out and they rip up some kid, or anybody for that matter. You know, if it's a vicious dog and it's a pet, you have to put that thing to death, get rid of it. You know, it's going to hurt somebody, right? So in the Mosaic law, if you know that animal was prone to do that and you didn't do something and it went and killed somebody, then you get put to death too, right? That animal is your responsibility. So the owner has to take responsibility for that. So the owner didn't go out and kill somebody. The animal did it. But here again, these are what we call repercussions of sin, and sometimes others take the brunt of that, right? All right, verse 17 and 18, back to Deuteronomy 24. Thou shalt not pervert judgment of the stranger, nor the fatherless, nor take a widow's raiment to pledge, but thou shalt remember that thou was a bondman in Egypt, and the Lord thy God redeemed thee thence. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. Okay, so we call this the treatment of strangers. So aliens, resident aliens, orphans, and widows oftentimes are at disadvantage in the culture, right? Sometimes they're needy people, and sometimes we need to just look upon them. You know, sometimes they have particular needs. They need care, love, compassion, justice. But it's easy to take advantage of them. It's easy for people in power that have money, it's easy for them to take advantage of the disadvantaged, the father. These are orphans and widows, right? It's interesting, James mentions that in his book, you know, and he talks about, you know, pure religion and undefiled before God, you know, is this: visit the orphans and the widows. Why? Because you don't get anything back. It's pure ministry, right? You don't get remunerated. You know, I'll visit the rich. Yeah, I'll get them to like me. Maybe they'll throw me a few cookies, right? No, but you go out and you visit the widows and the orphans. They don't have anything to give to you, right? It's pure ministry. So in the Mosaic law, they mention this quite often, and the prophets go after the Jewish leadership quite often for taking advantage of the widows and the orphans. So Moses mentions it here. And he always goes back to the fact that, hey, remember that you were also a resident alien and a slave down in Egypt, right? Don't ever forget that. So you wanted to be treated right down there, and you remember how you ought to treat other people, right? And so, and it goes back to Leviticus that says, you know, we should love God. Deuteronomy says, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And then Leviticus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said those were the two greatest commandments, right? So we're supposed to treat people right and be compassionate to people. The Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talked about mercy, and he said, be merciful unto others and you'll receive mercy. Right? Treat people the way you want to be treated, right? And treat people fairly. So verse 19 through 22, there's a little bit of a further expanse on this idea of how do you treat people? How do you treat widows and the fatherless and the poor in general? Okay, so then we get to verse 19. When thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and thou hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, or for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. When thou beatest thy olive tree, thou shalt not go to the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger and the fatherless and the widow, right? When you gather the grapes in the vineyard, thou shalt not glean it afterwards. So anything that falls, don't be going and picking all up. Just leave that for the stranger and for the fatherless and for the widow. And thou shalt remember that thou was a bondman in the land of Egypt, Therefore, I command thee to do this thing. And so in the Mosaic law, the Jews were not supposed to plow the corners of their fields. They were supposed to just, don't go all the way to the end. Just cut around and make your turn, right? Leave those corners, and we're going to let the poor come in because they need to eat. And then if you drop things as you're harvesting, you don't turn around and get those. You just let it fall, because we have gleaners, they called them, and they would come through the fields, and they would glean the fields, and they'd pick up whatever they could. And it was just God's way of taking care of people that were poor, right? We see this in the book of Ruth, right? And Ruth comes back, and she ends up in the field of Boaz. He was a rich landowner, and she was able to get a whole lot of stuff. So I want to go to Leviticus here real quickly and just show you the initial law that God gave that Moses is reiterating here. So it would be Leviticus 19:9. Leviticus 19:9 says, "And when you reap the harvest in your land, thou shalt not wholly reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings," that's the stuff you drop, "from the harvest. Thou shalt not glean thy vineyard. Neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." Now, another verse down to, chapter 23. So we've got to go over to 23 in verse 22. And very similar here, he says, "When you reap the harvest in your land, thou shalt not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when thou reapest," that's the harvest, right? "Neither shalt thou gather any of the gleanings of thy harvest. Thou shalt leave them unto the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God." So this is what Moses is referring to in Deuteronomy, that we should be caring for the poor and the needy. And so when you're harvesting, you let that stuff go. Same thing with the grapes and other things, because you were a slave down in Egypt, and you know what it was like to be a slave, and you wanted people to treat you fairly and be compassionate to you. And in Leviticus it states, "Because I am God, you do this," right? Because God cares about people, right? Two greatest commandments: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. God cares about people. So that's the premise of that whole law that Moses reiterates. Okay, so we finished chapter 24, so the next sheet is going to have chapter 25 on it. And we call this prosecuting criminals, point 15. So again, he's going from one law to another, and there's no flow. Sometimes he jumps something totally different. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 3. Judges had the ability and the authority to hear cases of dispute between people. And so when a crime was committed, they had to hear the case. In every community and every village, they had elders, and they had people that were set up to right the wrongs of people and listen to cases when they came to the gate of the city. Sometimes they would use that expression. So whenever they did this, they would bring either you're guilty or you're innocent. There'd be a verdict that they'd have to proclaim. And there's always penalties that are given. And sometimes they have to pay 50 shekels, right? Sometimes they have to pay silver. Sometimes it's an animal. We got to give you 4 animals, because something got wronged. And you'll see this in Exodus in the Mosaic Code. So, but for certain violations that they don't specifically say, there was corporal punishment. Back in chapter 22, if a man falsely accuses his new bride of not being a virgin and is proven wrong, he gets chastised. It's a physical chastisement. They beat him. Then he's got to pay 100 shekels to the father, and then he can't divorce his wife all day. So they have all these penalties that they loop in. And so what we see is God regulates some of the punishment, and in chapter 25 it deals with physical chastisement, and we call that flogging or whipping. It was legal for certain crimes. I mean, he doesn't say which ones, and he doesn't spell out all of it, but he's just saying if you do this, if that's what the judgment is, These are the guidelines, okay? So let's look at it. Chapter 25, verse 1, if there's a controversy between men and they come into judgment, that means they're going to come to court, and the judges may judge them, they shall justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. They've got to make a decision. Somebody's right and somebody's wrong, okay? That's what it's saying. So everybody is entitled to a fair hearing and a fair court case. Okay. So then he gives this right and wrong thing. So he's got some rules. Number one, if a crime happens, if there's a dispute, it's got to go to court. Okay. They can't settle it one-on-one. It's got to go to court. That's number one. And when it goes to court, the judges will judge them. Number two, those judges have the responsibility and the authority to hear the case and make a decision. At the end, they're going to declare one is righteous and one is not. Okay? One is guilty, one isn't. Okay? Right and wrong. Verse 2, number 3. If they are guilty, penalties are to be administered. And in this situation, it is a physical lashing or whipping. So verse 2, it says, and it shall be, it says, and it shall be, if the wicked man be worthy to be beaten. Okay, so in other words, and he doesn't say what cases and what's the scenario. He just says, if in this scenario, and they probably knew what it was, it fits under physical punishment, here's how you're going to do it. Okay. Rule number one. It needs to be public, and it needs to be in the presence of the judges. So he says here, verse 2, if he's worthy of being beaten, that the judge shall cause him to lie down. So this has to be public. This is rule number one. It has to be public, and it has to be before the judges. Okay? And you're going to have both parties present. You're going to have the guilty party and their family, and you're going to have the one who got offended and their family. So everybody's going to be there. It's going to be public. And this guards against private mob lynchings, right? So which could easily happen. It's got to be public. It's got to be out there, and the judges has to be before the judges, so they make sure everything's done in the right way. Right? So it's a guard against getting a group of people together, grab the guy, and hang him, right? or beat him to death, or whatever they want to do, right? So it's both. They have witnesses. They have witnesses of both parties there, plus the judges. That's rule number one. Number two, there was a certain number of lashes for certain crimes, but we don't know what that is because it doesn't say. Okay? And it says here that he is to lie down and to be beaten before his face, before the judges, according to his fault by a certain number. So for certain situations, there was a certain number of lashings, but we don't know what it is. He doesn't tell us, but they knew. It was a common knowledge. And so when a judge had the authority to say, well, I've got a certain amount of lashes I can save, and so this guy did such and such a thing, and so the judges determined he should get 15 lashes for this. This other guy, he needs 25, right? And so they could determine, a judge had the authority to make those kinds of judgments within a scope of how many lashes a person could get, okay? And this brings us back to where it says, according to the certain number, brings us back to a principle that we follow in our country, and that is in the Latin, it would be lex talionis. Lex talionis means the punishment fits the crime, right? Somebody steals a candy bar. We don't chop his hand off, give him 10 years in prison, right? You say, well, he only stole a candy bar. It was only $1. How much does candy bar cost? I don't know what they charge now, but it's probably $1.79, you know. It can't be $1.80. It's always, $1.79, you know. Got to save a penny there, you know. It makes it look better. But, you wouldn't do that, would you? That would be excessive, right? Who would do that crazy thing? So lex talionis was a principle that, and the Americans came, really developed this here, because in Britain they were doing crazy things. And the Americans were saying, this is not right. And so they came up with this lex talionis. It comes out of the Latin. It means the punishment should fit the crime. It shouldn't be excessive. So that's what number 2 is. Number 3 is there is a limitation to the amount of lashings regardless of the offense. So the worst case scenario, the guy did the worst thing and he's going to get lashed. Here's what verse 3 says, 40 stripes he may give him and not exceed. Lest if he exceed and beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee. And so this law in Deuteronomy gave way to what occurred in Jewish law that's not in the Bible, that they should get 39 lashes. Because Deuteronomy said, do not do more than 40. The Jews said, we'll do 39 because what if we miscounted? That's pretty smart, right? They didn't want to violate the 40. I mean, if you go, we're going to give them 40, and I miscounted, I gave them 41, I broke the law, right? So they go, okay, let's do 39, and we'll end at 39. That's the top. So if I messed up on one count, we didn't break the law, right? So it made sense to do that. I'm not trying to criticize them too much, but they wanted to be safe, right? And so the law of Hammurabi, which was an old Babylonian law, they had 60 lashes, law 202. The Assyrian law code, between 40 and 50 lashes, no more, it would say. The Romans didn't have a set number, and they were known for cruelty and harshness. And but oftentimes when they dealt with the Jews and to keep the peace, the Romans would do the 39 thing. Okay, because they didn't want to get the Jews mad, and then they go back to Caesar, and then I'm in trouble. So they kind of they knew how to play the game a little bit, but they really didn't have a number in the Roman law. So if they wanted to grab somebody and beat them 80 times, they could do that, and it would probably kill them, right? And many people died through lashings. So Paul, we saw last week in 2 Corinthians 11. You know, he was beaten a number of times. He had the Jews and then the Romans, and so he got beaten, and it was probably the 39 lash thing. I don't know. I don't know how many he got, but they couldn't do more than that. Right? So, and it says there, lest, right in the middle of verse 3, lest thy brother should seem vile unto thee. The NASB translating it's all the same Hebrew text, and they say degraded in your eyes, and actually the Hebrew actually uses the word for eyes. The New King James says, lest your brother be humiliated in your sight. And so that's kind of the idea, this excessive type of punishment, giving somebody more than what they deserve would really becoming terribly humiliating to that person. And so the law of Moses identifies that and says, no, you shouldn't do that. Okay. Oh, sorry, Bill, yes. Yes, sir. No. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so, and I mean, there's a whole process, and we've done this, we've had it in the church here too, and so, and we call it first step, second step, third step, fourth step of church discipline. We've had a number of situations that nobody knows about because of it. We don't say anything because we went to them and we talked to them and they repented and we had a great time and they realized they were wrong. We don't announce that, you know, and nobody knows. The deacons maybe know, but nobody knows. We just say, hey, they dealt with, they want help sometimes, we give them counsel. Fine. They rebel and then they don't. We work with them for a long time, and if it gets to that point where they're just not going to, then we do have to use the next step, the third step, and then even the fourth step where we just put, you can't even come here. So, but we don't lash them. Yeah, we that doesn't work real good. Kind of hurts church growth, I think. All right. Fairness to animals, verse 4. And again, they just kind of toss this one in here. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn. So animals were created by God, and man's created by God. But animals are not created in the image of God, so there's a big difference. But animals were designed to help us and to serve us. And so there's a sense of dignity and fair treatment to animals. And you'll find this in other spots in the Mosaic Law, in the book of Proverbs also. And so it's not wrong to kill an animal, right? And sometimes we need to kill. We need to eat, right? So if you like beef, you kill. Now they couldn't eat pork back then, but if you want to eat pork, you can. But it's not wrong to kill an animal for means of survival. And then there's other byproducts that you can get, clothing and various things you can get from the byproducts of animals. That's not wrong. Kill an animal, it's not like it goes to heaven or hell, right? They're all moral creatures. And so, and in fact, God designed the sacrificial system, right? Picture of the sacrifice of Christ and the atonement and all that. And so animals could be put up on the altar, and then they would burn them, and they'd eat them too, right? The priest would eat them. And then sometimes the person that brought the sacrifice would get some of that also. And so, but after the flood, man was pretty much fruit and veggie before that. And then after the flood, God gave permission to eat meat, and they probably needed the extra protein, and because we just don't have the nutrients that they had before the flood. So, if it's a need for survival, then yeah, we're able to do that. So in this verse, it's interesting. It's quoted in the New Testament in a couple of spots, 1 Corinthians 9, 7 through 9, and 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18. And so animals deserve dignity and reward. And so while they're working, you can't, what are we going to pay an animal $10 an hour? What are they, here's some silver, and the animal's going to go, okay, I'm putting it in his pocket. It'd be ridiculous, right? But an animal works, and he should be rewarded. So Moses said, you got to feed your animal. And so when he's working and the grain falls, he can just eat off of that. It'll nourish his body, he'll get strengthened, and he'll be able to serve you better while you work. So the New Testament takes that verse and uses it to say that pastors should be supported for their work, because even animals get supported for their work. Therefore, pastors should also be supported. And that's the argumentation that's used in those two passages I mentioned to you, 1 Corinthians 9, 7 through 9, and 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18. Animals should be treated fairly and taken care of, okay? Then we come to verses 5 through 10. It's called the Levirate marriage, okay? The Levirate marriage is literally means marriage with a brother-in-law, and has nothing to do with the tribe of Levi. I know it's very confusing. First time I saw it, I thought it had something to do with Levi, but it's actually a Latin word that is used. Leviri is the term in Latin, and it means the husband's brother. So in ancient times, even before the Mosaic Law, way back, this was a common cultural practice. And the practice was that if a man died without having a child, his unmarried brother was then under obligation to marry the widow and to have children to carry on the name of the deceased brother. Okay, and so that was the key idea behind it. So an example of this is in Genesis 38. Okay, Genesis 38. Before the Mosaic Law, and Judah is married, and he has several sons. And so the story was his son E-R, also means emergency room, but back then that was his name, the E-R. In Genesis 38, he married a girl named Tamar. We know a lot about her, right? And so, but it says that the son of Judah, was very wicked. We don't know what he did, but he was a pretty bad guy. Now, you got to think about this from God's perspective. Judah is the messianic link, right? The Messiah is going to come through Judah. Kings are going to come out of Judah. This is an important situation. And so Judah's oldest son is and he's a terrible person, right? So this is going to come to an end, right? So it just says God slew him. God took him out. God killed him. That's right. Bad news. Whoa. So Tamar's now widowed. So little brother, I assume, right, is going to have to take up the responsibility of marrying Tamar, right? So it tells us in verse 8, Genesis 38:8, Judah says to Anan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty. This is this idea of a Levirate type of marriage situation, so that you can bring up or raise up a seed for your brother or an offspring for your brother. Right? So he goes in, and I think, Anan liked the idea of sleeping with Tamar. He thought that was cool, but he had no intent. He didn't want to father this child because he would actually be responsible to raise that child. He didn't like that idea. So he liked the one part, but he didn't like the other part, right? We call that a deadbeat dad. I think he didn't even want to be the dad, right? I got this thing figured out. My dad told me to go do this, I'll do it, but I got a plan of my own. So verse 9 says, Anan knew that the child wouldn't be his, right? So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled the semen out on the ground, lest to give seed or offspring unto his brother. So he had this thing, he knew that he was going to carry on the brother's name. He didn't want to do that. He didn't want to be the father. He didn't want to take care of that kid. So he said, I got my own plan. God didn't like that. And it tells us right there, Yahweh was displeased with him. That word displeased can even mean wicked or evil. And it says in verse 10, and God killed him, right? He slew him. Whew. 2 kids down, 3rd to go, right? Who's the next kid in line, right? I tell you what, if I was Sheila, I'd be like, oh, I don't know about marrying this girl. I'd be like, time out, Dad. So thankfully, Sheila was too young, and she was going to have to wait a long time for him to grow up before she could marry him. So Tamar says, well, I think I'm going to fix this thing. She goes into action. And she knows Judah better than anybody else knows Judah, and she figures this out. Hey, if I dress up like a harlot, I think I can allure him. She must have knew something about Judah that we didn't know. And she was right, and she did it, and she got pregnant with twins. And the one twin's name was Perez. And he's in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. Judah and Tamar have a child, have 2 kids, and the one is the messianic link. Can you come up with a crazier story than this? I mean, it's just unreal that the line of, and this, it's immoral, right? And in fact, it gets brought out that Tamar is pregnant and Judah is going to burn her alive, right? He wants to execute her. She's immoral, and then she shows him the tokens, and it was like, oh, actually, those were mine. Uh-oh, I got fooled. So he's like, actually, don't kill her. And those kids are my kids, actually. So God's going to work his will, and sometimes it's through bad things. He works his will out, and these other kids that were they were bad guys, and he wanted to have somebody that was going to be that messianic link, and it was Perez. I didn't write the book. I didn't come up with it, but that's what it says. All right. So this whole Levirate marriage was in the culture of the day, but Moses puts it into law. And we see it here in Deuteronomy, right? Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5 and 6. So let me just take a peek here real quick, and we'll read here a little bit. If brethren dwell together, and one of them die and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without to a stranger, but the husband's brother shall go unto her and take him to wife and perform the duty of a husband to his brother, to a husband's brother unto her. And verse 6 is really the whole key. And it shall be that the firstborn which she beareth shall succeed in the name of the brother which is dead, the deceased brother, that the name will not be put out of Israel. They want to preserve the name of the brother. That's why they did it. They get the land, and you go to Numbers 36, they had the 4 daughters, and they didn't marry, but they wanted the land. They said, yeah, the land's still yours, but the name's going to disappear. And so this was an effort to preserve the name and pass the name on, right, through the male firstborn son. And so that's why it's been inserted here in the Mosaic Law, okay? So another great example of this was the story of Ruth and Boaz, right? Because Ruth is a Moabite, and Naomi and her sons, they go over to Moab because of the famine, and they marry these Moabite girls, and Ruth is one of them. But she believes, and she goes back after the brothers die, the 2 brothers die, and then so it's Naomi and Ruth, and they're widowed, and they come back into the land. They're poor, and so Ruth ends up working in the field, and we saw some of that earlier about gleaning the fields. And but then they figure out that they're this near relative of Boaz, and so Boaz could actually become the kinsman redeemer, is what they called it. And so, Ruth goes out, works the fields, and she meets Boaz, and she likes him, and he likes her, but she poses the idea to him about getting married and picking up and doing this stuff, fulfilling this. But Boaz says, actually, there's somebody else that's before me, and nobody knew about that. So they got to go through the ropes, right? It's all legal proceedings. And so the guy did reject Ruth. He wanted the land, but he didn't want Ruth. But that doesn't go. You have to take the girl too. You don't want the girl, but she was a Moabite, and we don't know about that, So he rejects this. That sets Boaz up to be the one, and then Boaz marries Ruth, and this sets up the whole line of David and the Messiah. So this is another incredible messianic link in this story. And then we find later, after the destruction of the Second Temple, it doesn't seem like anybody was following this law. I don't know if any cultures still do it. Maybe they do in some cultures today, but it kind of went extinct in the culture of the day. Verses 7 through 10 follows a procedure that if the man did refuse, here is what it would have to happen. So if we go back to the text here, verse 7 says, if the man like not to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up unto the gate of the elders, saying, my husband's brother refuses. So this is all legal. This is a legal court proceeding they have to go through. My husband's brother refuses to take up unto his brother the name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. The elders of the city shall call him. You're getting subpoenaed, right? You got to show. And he shall say to him, if he shall stand to it and say, I like not to take her. So they allowed you to make a decision. They allowed you to refuse. And as we find out later in the Ruth story, she could go to the next of kin and to the next of kin, and she could do that. Or she can just say, I think I'm done. I'm tired of these guys blowing me off, right? So now that the brother or the next of kin, he refuses, then in verse 9, it has this kind of a ritual situation that you have to go through. And it says, then shall the brother's wife, the widowed woman, shall come to him in the presence of the elders, and they're out in the middle of this court hearing at the gate. She shall loose his shoe from his foot. She takes one of his shoes, and then she spits in his face. This is the legal proceeding. Okay, I'm not making this up. It's right there, right? This is in verse 9. And shall answer and say, so shall it be done unto that man that will not build up his brother's house. He's letting his brother's name die out. And his name shall be called in Israel, and the house of him that has his shoe loosed. You got to walk around with one shoe on, I got to go buy another pair because I can't buy one shoe, just doesn't. Do you ever do that? You can't do that, right? So it was humiliating, it was embarrassing, and it was designed to humiliate him because he's letting his brother's name go. Now, she can go to the next of kin and next of kin and next of kin. Somebody had a hand up. Yeah. It was all there, yeah. It was probably, they already were doing stuff like this. You know, like I said, the Levirate marriage, it was back with Judah. It was before the Mosaic Law. So it was in the culture of the day. So they do things like that with the shoe. Remember when Bush was speaking and they took the shoe and they threw the shoe at him? And Bush is up there, he's like, he did move pretty quick. It was pretty funny. But that must have been a common thing. Take your shoe off and throw the shoe at the guy. It was a sandal, right? So anyway, for whatever, that's kind of the way the program went back then. So they would, she takes the thing off, spit in his face. And he had to do it. He couldn't, if he ever tried to go against what the law said, they'd arrest him. He could get, maybe they would whip him. So I got to stand there and get spit in the face because I'm refusing to carry on. But the girl could go to the next of kin, and this is what happened with Ruth, right? And she was able to go to Boaz, and Boaz said, I do, and they got married, and then we got another messianic link, right? So, well, I'm already over. I'm sorry. So we'll have to pick up in verse 11 next week. Yes. Flogged. All right, we better wrap it up here. Sorry, guys. Father, thank you for the day and for the privilege we have to teach the Word of God and unpack a lot of Scripture that I think we don't often even read, but it's there, and we teach through the Word. So thank you again. We pray now, prepare our hearts for the